I think we can say with complete confidence that, sadly, I guess if you're Ukrainian, all of the heavy weapon systems, Patriot missiles, radars, uh, tanks, artillery, EW, all of the equipment that requires people to crew it has all been destroyed. They've used a number of Iskander missiles, a missile that has a range out to about 310 miles, to about, normally between 250 and 310, carrying a warhead that can be 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 pounds, different kinds. I know they've used some fuel air explosive as well as high explosive, and it's just devastated them. They also have on either side of their flanks right now very tough fighters, Chechens, Wagner, and also some soldiers from the Russian Volunteer Corps. And they are cut off from retreating back into Ukraine. I don't think very many of these people will survive. How many are Americans and Brits? Because as you rightly point out, I think we can call this tragically a NATO invasion, even though they may well not be in Ukrainian, or maybe in Ukrainian uniform as opposed to their own. And you also have Polish soldiers and officers. So this conglomerate has really gotten into trouble. They're not going to make it. We started at the outset of this tragic war with promises that whatever we in the West did, it would be defensive against the Russians. And I don't think there was ever any intention for U.S. manufactured, British manufactured, German manufactured weapon systems to end up being used in offensive action against Russia, but it's happened. And from the Russian standpoint, they don't mince words. They are very clear. As far as they're concerned, this was not just a Ukrainian penetration into Russia. It was a NATO penetration, even though it didn't get very far. I would say maybe 20, 30 miles, perhaps 10 miles across. All of these frantic claims of occupation of areas and taking ground, and so it's all nonsense. I think we need to get that straight. Nothing happens in NATO that Washington does not initiate and does not approve. If you take Washington out of the equation, I seriously doubt that very many NATO members would have wanted to have anything to do with this. Now, also, I might add that Zelensky was promised a lot of things, not the least of which was that the entire scientific industrial power of the United States and its allies would be behind him, that he would have limitless quantities of equipment and ammunition, and that he would win because we insisted that Russia was backward and incapable. Today, I received a communication from Europe, and the communication came to me from the Balkans, principally from Croatia, but some other states as well, people arguing against any further action and making the point that Article 5, this is this trigger for conflict in theory,
right,
really does not obligate anyone in NATO to join a war that they don't support. And the argument that they made to me was, we don't support what's happening in Russia. We really never did. We're not part of it. We're not sending anything over there. So make sure Americans understand that if they initiate a war and they expect us, these are people in the Balkans, to support them, it's not going to happen. Commander of Europe, he holds the same title that Eisenhower did at the end of the war when he was the initial commander of what was then not really NATO, but Allied Forces Europe.
Right.
And in theory, he commands all of those forces. But the truth is that in the event of any emergency, any conflict or crisis, the various parliamentary bodies and their presidents have to give permission for the use of their forces, their capabilities, their resources. And that's something one cannot assume, because again, the people that were contacting me earlier today from the Balkans concerned about Article 5 pointed out that they had joined NATO because it was a defensive alliance. And they thought that this would enhance their national security and defend them. In truth, we all know that it's been a Trojan horse for offensive military action by the United States and its closest allies, primarily Britain, France, and to a lesser extent, Germany. We've gotten reports that certainly there was some evidence for the use of chlorine in 155 millimeter shells. I don't know if they came from the United States or Great Britain, but that's being reported. Obviously, you can't know with absolute certainty unless you're on the ground and test the soil. But at the time, I was very concerned about that because chlorine is a terrible poison. It ruins the environment. So if that's true, I hope the Russians have it under control. It's certainly a stupid idea. If no one was harmed, then I suppose in theory, you don't have a crime. But there's so many breaches of the Geneva Convention have characterized Ukrainian behavior that it's hard to say at this point. Well, we know that you've got Americans and British soldiers or mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, and probably a number of Polish soldiers as well. Are these people that were formerly in the armed forces and are now being hired and paid as mercenaries? Are these people temporarily on loan? You know, this is hard to tell. I'm not someone who spent a lot of time in special operations. And so a lot of things are possible when you move into the special operations realm with the intelligence agencies, and everything's designed to conceal the truth. But we know that there are at least 2,000 of the original 12,000 are people from the United States, Great Britain, and probably Poland, maybe more. How many of them have been killed or captured? I have no idea. I hope that none of them are captured or killed, but it looks pretty grim right now. You're on the knife edge here of admitting something that I don't think anyone in Washington is going to sign up for. I mean, of course, it's no mystery to the Russians. You know, no one is fooled by any of this. And we are playing a very dangerous game with Russia. I sat yesterday with a woman who spent many, many years in Russia, and she was explaining to me the level of hostility and anger in the Russian population. And the point she was making to me is that President Putin right now has enormous pressure on him from the Russian population to take decisive action.
Right.
There are patriotic songs. People are writing essays and poems, but there's this groundswell of support to essentially march west all the way to the Polish border and settle this. And the argument is there can be no more negotiation, and whatever we agree to will never be taken seriously. The only solution is to end the life of this independent Ukrainian nation state. I don't think that's what Putin wants to do. In fact, I know he doesn't. Remember, we were told there would be cracks in Russian society, that there was discontent inside Russian society, that people would rebel against the use of Russian troops in Ukraine. None of that came to fruition. For every one person who may have raised an objection, there were thousands that absolutely supported it because everyone knew it was in their national security interest to have a friendly state, or at least a neutral state, right, on Russia's western border. He understands that if they confront us and we confront them militarily, that there is a potential for escalation to the nuclear level. He's made this clear repeatedly, that that's something he doesn't want and wants to avoid at all cost. So I think that's really the underlying theme. I think there's something else here that we need to mention. Our media continues to misinform the public in the West and tells them that everyone is behind Zelensky, the Ukrainians want to fight to the bitter end, no one will give up. Well, that's just not true. The Ukrainian army is a shadow of its former self. Large numbers of people are defecting. If they can surrender and survive, they do. If they can get out of the area and escape, they do. No one that's overseas that's fled this place wants to come back and die pointlessly in this war. So I think we're dealing with a puppet government, and Putin knows that. And he's not interested, it has never been interested in killing millions of Ukrainians. That was never the goal. That's all nonsense. So I think that's part of it as well. He wants to settle this thing. He simply wants whatever remains of Ukraine to be a neutral state. A number of us have been rather surprised that he hasn't taken that action. I think on the one hand, he'd like to have someone to talk to end this thing. So I'm sure that's part of his rationale for not having done it. I think also he wants to spare Kiev. You know, Kiev has a unique position in the history of Russia and the entire region. It's the cradle of Russian Orthodox religion and culture. It's the last place he wants to inflict damage on. So you put those together, he's held back. Now, is he currently considering a decisive strike once and for all and moving forces into the city? I imagine he probably is, but it's probably a last resort even now for him. I think you have to admit that you have these people that have no idea what they're talking about. They don't understand consequences for the Ukrainians. They don't even understand the potential consequences for us. And we seem to be ready to turn whatever is left of Ukraine and its homeland into a wasteland. I don't think that's what anybody set out to fight for. He's someone else that we have tried to demonize virtually from the first day that he took power. But in his favor, he's tried very hard to promote peace. Now, his bottom line argument is not wrong. The Ukrainians have tried to push the Russians into extreme action. And that's why I said before, I'm sure extreme action, short of a nuclear weapon, is on the table with Putin. But it's not something he wants to take. And I think the president knows that. Lukashenko is absolutely aware that that's the case. There are 8 million people living in Belarusia. That's not very many. Remember, at the outset of this war, there were, 40 million, we estimate, perhaps a little more, maybe a little less in Ukraine.
Right.
Belarus is very small in terms of population. But with the agreement from Lukashenko, President Putin has pushed tactical nuclear weapons, Russian tactical nuclear weapons, forward in a position to defend Belarusia. Belarusia has worried about attacks from Poland and Lithuania. Again, you got to go back and look at the history of the region. And at least half of what we call Belarusia was part of Polish Lithuania for a very long time. And so he's not unreasonably concerned about attacks against him. Well, to their credit, the Iranian regime has not behaved impulsively. I would argue that if anyone is emotional and impulsive in this setting, it's very much Mr. Netanyahu. I think the Iranians are not interested in a war which could spell the destruction and the end of Israel, as well as potentially for themselves if the Israelis strike them with nuclear weapons. I think they want to give peace a chance, even though the probability of a settlement and a ceasefire in Gaza is, quite frankly, remote. I think they're going to hold off for that reason. I also think that there are enormous numbers of Russian technicians and soldiers on the ground in Iran helping to set up an integrated air and missile defense structure, and also to put in place electronic warfare equipment, missiles, other capabilities that will make Iran certainly much more secure and much more formidable as an opponent, because they have to assume that if they fight with the Israelis, that they will end up at war with us. And obviously, they have a great deal of respect for what we can do to them with air and naval power. I can't give you an ironclad response that says there will never be something like a compromise of some sort. I can't. And I'm reluctant to do so, because I would like to see something which is better than what we have now, which is this unending stalemate that can only be broken through some sort of mutual suicide. So I'm hopeful that, we could find a way out of this morass, but admittedly, it's hard to imagine. You cannot do what the Israelis have done in Gaza. And every report I see tells me that the reports of the dead are gross underestimates. And of course, if you say that, the Israelis attack you and say, oh, well, the Arabs, they lie about everything. The problem is that the Israelis have told the people in the region that they are animals, that they are not human, they are subhuman, that they deserve to be exterminated. You tell that to your neighbors. What do you expect will happen?
Right.
Can you reasonably expect to have a compromise at any time in the future? As unreasonable as that sounds, he's expressing a view that is more widely held in Israel than I think most Americans understand. They see this as an all or nothing proposition. And they're effectively sending the message that we refuse to live in a region with people that we cannot control. And that's the bottom line. If you cannot control the Amalek, the people that live around you that you've dismissed as subhuman, then the only alternative is to kill them in large numbers and drive them out, or for you to pack up your things and leave. And they are not going to leave, not at this point. I think it's a terrible situation for Israel to be in, but they've put themselves into this position, and they are demanding, and we are providing unconditional support for them in this crusade. Somebody said, do you just want to walk out of Afghanistan? I said, no, I want to run out. And what they don't understand is that we are preeminently a maritime and air power. We are only temporarily on the ground wherever we go on the Eurasian landmass. It doesn't matter where you go, it's a temporary phenomenon. And we need to make that very clear. And this notion of staying in order to change people and cultures and a way of life, to introduce political institutions that have no foundation in the area, this is all nonsense. And then the least thoughtful among us, the least well educated about these matters, stand up and say, we're Americans, we don't cut and run, we fight to the end. Well, yeah, let's fight to the end, but not in places that are of marginal at best interest to us. Let's not brutalize and murder people because they don't necessarily want to live in the liberal democratic paradise that we're trying to export at gunpoint. You know, it's so disappointing because, frankly, this man O'Reilly has never changed. Right. He's part of the bombs away club. You know, anybody who wants to bomb anybody anywhere is a patriot, and anybody who objects is a loser, gutless, not a patriot, you know.